G'day mates, it's the Doctor here, and welcome back to another episode of Untapped Potential. This time we're going to be looking at Iron Chains. Now, I have a particular fondness with this deck because when we started playing Yu-Gi-Oh, we played a bunch of random cards, right? No actual theme or deck, so to speak. But Iron Chains was the first theme deck that I played with because I like the idea of doing something different where you're decking your opponent out, which is supposedly the focus of the deck, but as we're about to go over, this is one of the worst decks ever made, and recently another YouTuber, Rata, made a case asking his fans, what is the worst deck in Yu-Gi-Oh? And, well, some decks may be poorly realized with their identity or their strategy, but with Iron Chains, it's a deck that's at war with itself, and let's go over it. So, Iron Chains was used by Armstrong in the Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's anime. They've never been reprinted, they've never had legacy support, and, well, let's start with the cards themselves. So, with Iron Chain Repairman, which is probably the best support for the deck, if it destroys a monster in battle, inflict 300 damage to your opponent. Once per turn, you can special summon an Iron Chain monster from your graveyard, except this monster cannot attack. So, it's a revival for the graveyard, except this deck, has no actual feasible way to discard or mill or anything. Like, it doesn't mill your own deck, so how are you supposed to get your monsters to the graveyard turn 1? Because it's not exactly known for swarming the field, or splashing, if that's the term. But there you go, it's a monster reborn for the deck. And next up, we have Iron Chain Snake. So, during the main phase, you can equip this monster to... Sorry, a bit of dirt there. Equip it to a monster your opponent controls, loses 800 attack and defense. When it's destroyed in battle, while equipped with this monster, its controller sends cards from the top of their deck to the graveyard equal to the level of that monster. Well, these days we have Link ratings, we have the Xyz rankings, so yeah, 800, that's alright, and you know, if it was sent to a graveyard by Iron Chain Repairman, then it could do something. Next up is the tuner monster, Iron Chain Coil. So, you can target an Iron Chain monster you control, including itself, and it gains 300 attack and defense. So, this is alright, but again, as a tuner monster, you want to synchro summon another guy. Like, this is as long as this card is face up on the field, so that's kind of a problem, isn't it? So, like, unless you want to keep buffing up Iron Chain Coil, then you can do that, but as a tuner monster, you want to send it to the graveyard for a synchro summon. And then, the last monster in the main deck is Iron Chain Blaster. Once per turn, you can send an Iron Chain monster you control to the graveyard and inflict 800 damage. So, as you can see, this is also a burn-reliant deck as well. But, yeah, this doesn't do much to... because Iron Chain Repairman is the only monster in the deck that can special summon, and with Blaster, now you're sending your monsters to the graveyard for burn damage? Well, where is the milling part come from? So far we only have Iron Chain Snake, but then we have the main spell card, and there's a reason I brought my 3 copies out. So this is Poison Chain. During the end phase of your turn, if you did not attack, your opponent sends cards equal to the number of face-up Iron Chain monsters you control from the top of their deck to the graveyard. And there on the artwork, we appropriately have Iron Chain Coil and Iron Chain Snake. The funny thing is, this card doesn't actually support the deck, despite being the only spell and trap support in the Iron Chain archetype. There is another spell card that is related to the deck, and it's called Paralyzing Chain, which is a horrific version of Skull Invitation. Rather than burning your opponent for 300 cards individually, with Paralyzing Chain, he burns them for 300 every time a card is sent from their deck to the graveyard, and that was printed as a rare card, like Iron Chain Repairman. But it's just a terrible version of Skull Invitation. Now, with Poison Chain, what's noteworthy about this card... keeps going out of focus. What's noteworthy about this card is, in the anime, your opponent sends cards from the top of their deck to the graveyard equal to the level of your Iron Chain monsters that you have on the field, and so they nerfed it, kind of like Elemental Hero Bubble Man. And I think the reason why they did that is because if you have multiple copies of Poison Chain, then it times that number your opponent sends from their deck to the graveyard up to the number of Iron Chain monsters you control. So if you have 2 Poison Chains, then it doubles. Because there's nothing on the cards in the text that says you can only control 1 face-up Poison Chain. So you can control multiple, and that's how I was able to win back in the day. Not a lot of wins. I never topped with this deck. Not only because I was young, or because the game was like in early stages or something. This was 5D, so we're talking like 2009. But yeah, it was fun to win with this deck. Next up, we have the boss monster, which did see some play back in the day, which is Iron Chain Dragon. And yeah, it's unfortunately a bit beat up here, but it's a generic monster, despite being part of an archetype. And with this monster, you can remove all Iron Chain monsters from your graveyard, and this monster gains 200 attack for each until the end phase. If it inflicts battle damage, send the top 3 cards from your opponent's deck to the graveyard. How would you do that? Because you want to use Poison Chain, right? But yet, you have cards like Iron Chain Dragon, Iron Chain Repairman, that have effects that rely on destroying monsters in battle or inflicting battle damage, and like, what are you supposed to do with this deck? And the worst part is, this is literally all the cards in the Iron Chain deck. So yeah, I think there's a reason Konami they created this deck as like a one-off archetype, and yeah, the mindset behind this deck, it's kind of baffling, isn't it? Not even kind of, it's just as baffling as like Dino Wrestlers or Gen X or whatever other terrible deck you can think of. And these days, being a mill deck can be detrimental to you because the graveyard nowadays acts as like a secondary hand for players, right? Because you get additional effects from the cards in the graveyard by banishing them or special summoning them, add them to hand, and etc, etc. So that's why, if it were to have legacy support, there should be a field spell, probably based off the facility from the anime, because as we know, Konami likes to base some modern cards off like events from the anime, like Bingo Machine Go, and they could print a field spell for Iron Chains that works as like Necro Valley that turns off the graveyard for them, and maybe do more mill damage and stuff. So what we have here is a deck that has no idea what it wants to do. On the one hand, we have some cards like Iron Chain Repairman and Iron Chain Dragon that rely on destroying opponent's monsters in battle, inflicting battle damage. Then you have Poison Chain that restricts you from attacking, so well, that turns off Repairman and Dragon from being useful. And then you have Iron Chain Blaster that wants to do burn damage, and I guess Repairman also does burn damage in a way. And then there's the Paralyzing Chain that I mentioned earlier. Like, what are you supposed to do with this deck? What does it want to do? So, it's a mess, and probably why it is one of the worst decks, if not the worst deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it is the closest we have to a mill-focused deck. I guess you could say the jars fit that criteria, or the worms in their early stage, not the alphabetical worms that are also reptilians, but there was also another worm monster called Warm Worm that, when destroyed, would send the top 3 cards from your opponent's deck to the graveyard. And these guys, they kind of work with Iron Chains, except I guess Insect Mill might have been a thing back in the day with Needleworm, and combined with the jar monsters. This strategy was used by Trudge when he was possessed in the Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's anime, which was a one-off duel with that deck in particular. But what could Konami do with Iron Chains? I think they might be afraid, because there are a few cards that also do mill damage to your opponent, but deck destruction, if you will. So we have cards like a present card, which also hasn't been reprinted since Invasion Vengeance. There was more recently Soul Levy. I'm actually not sure what card this set is. I'm actually not sure what set this card is from, but you can only draw one of these, so I guess that's an improvement from Poison Chain, kind of. And each time your opponent special summons a monster, send the top 3 cards from their deck to the graveyard. Kind of a random card they printed, and I do like they put a Soul Tower, or Bone Tower, whatever it's called, And I believe that was another mill strategy you could focus on, those mill zombies. So we've got the insects, the jars, and have any of them been good? I think the soul burning tower, or actually, yeah, the jar ones were good with empty jar back in the days, like even before 5Ds. But with present card, how you can make your opponent discard their entire hand and draw 5 cards, that may be a bit much, because it is easy to like deck out your opponent if you have the right cards with card destruction and hand destruction and all that. But as I said, you may be giving your opponent ammunition to wipe you out, and this deck has no protection. May I make that clear? There is no cards in the Iron Chain archetype that protects them, and that's ridiculous. As for spell and trap support, now that could be awkward because there's all these other chain cards like Chain Disappearance, Chain Destruction, Chain Hole, and there's also Chain Strike, which is burn damage, but I guess that fits in with the Iron Chain archetype, doesn't it? Because it's also a burn-focused deck. My goodness, what a mess. So, if Konami was to do Iron Chain support, I'll put up a list on screen for you to read, and some of the cards that I've thought of, even back in the day, because I've always loved Iron Chains despite all their flaws, and that may be because part 2 of the duel with Armstrong, who played Iron Chains, that was my introduction to Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D, so it was a duel in which the main character doesn't even use his main deck like Junk Seacron, Junk Warrior, and all his other Seacron Junk cards. But as for some of the Iron Chain cards that I thought of, there's a Boss Monster Iron Chain Goliath, and oh yeah, despite being used by a police officer, the closest police-like is Repairman, but I think they could go with a more police-themed support, like Iron Chain Warden, Iron Chain Officer, Inspector Gizmo. This is a card that's a play off Inspector Gadget, and look, this was long before I really took Yu-Gi-Oh! Seriously, because I've been doing well at tournaments, but I've yet to come first. It's come second a few times. But, yeah, this is what I thought of back in the day, and I'm proud of the way I formatted these cards that are printed. Okay, so what I failed to communicate was how to differentiate the spell and trap support for Iron Chains, where instead of chain cards, they'd be called shackled cards, and that's why I've called them shackled. I even have a list of shackled cards that I came up with. So, probably came up with more custom-made cards than any other deck in the entire game, but I guess that's my nostalgic bias for Iron Chain. But yeah, I failed to communicate that in the initial recording, so here's why I called the spell and trap support shackled cards. Iron Chains need a lot of help. There is so much room they could do with Iron Chain monsters like basic names like Prisoner or puns like Executioner. And they could also have effects that work in the graveyard, like Helperwhammer. Though Konami doesn't usually like hand destruction cards, that's why a few of those cards are banned, like Confiscation and all of them. And Helperwhammer's not a good card, but they could do something similar like this that's in a way protection that makes your opponent hesitant to attack, otherwise they'd be losing cards from their deck, they'd be losing cards from their hand. So, they could retrain Helperwhammer to Iron Chain Helperwhammer. That is like a prisoner that's, you know, going through a hard time. Clearly, being tortured to something. And, let's not forget, Trickstar is kind of a mill deck in of itself, and I'm gonna have a deck profile for Halloween, so at the time of recording, I'm about to film that deck profile, which I'll be uploading in a couple of days' time. So if you want to see a Halloween-focused or Halloween-themed mill deck, then that's going to be my Halloween special of the year. So, what did you think of Iron Chains? Is it the worst deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! History? And what could Konami do to improve the Iron Chain archetype? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, like, share as well, please. Let's get the conversation going. Let's talk about Iron Chains. Is it the worst deck in Yu-Gi-Oh? What could Konami do to improve it? Until next time, take care, mates.